Welcome back to another episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Daniel Watkins.
And I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And on today's episode, we're going back inside the staterooms of Alnwick Castle to talk about two of the most important parts of the castle's collections.
In the drawing room are two huge, beautifully decorated cabinets, often called the Cucci Cabinets. Originally, they were made for Louis XIV of France for his palace of Versailles. Their connection to Alnwick Castle began when they were purchased by the 3rd Duke of Northumberland in the first half of the 19th century. Today, they are two of the rare surviving examples of the furnishings at Versailles, making them some of the most significant pieces of historical furniture anywhere in the world.
To find out more about the cabinets and their story, we spoke to Yannick Chastang, a conservator and expert who knows these two objects inside out, literally as he spent 18 months in the early 2010s helping to preserve them for future generations.
Here is our conversation with Yannick. We hope you enjoy it.
We are very pleased to welcome conservator Yannick Chastang to the Alnwick Castle podcast. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for welcoming me and thank you for having me today.
You've joined us today to talk about Alnwick Castle's most famous pieces of furniture. So to start, could you first of all tell us why these two cabinets in the drawing room are so famous? What makes them so special?
I think you've downsized their importance because while they are possibly the most important at Alnwick, they are also some of the most important in the world. And it's not me trying to boost them. They are so important because they are some of the only surviving cabinets from the time of Louis XIV. Louis XIV may not need too much introduction, but of course he was a Sun King. He was the longest reign in French king and one of the most powerful and successful king in the French history. So the Alnwick cabinet represent everything about Louis XIV. So not only they are fantastic, they look grand, they are enormous, you're not going to miss them when you visit Alnwick, but they are the very, very rare surviving cabinets. So of all of the cabinets that were made for Louis XIV, and there were quite a few actually, they are the only two that have survived since the 17th century. And that's what makes really, really them extremely important. They represent perfectly Louis XIV. But the other thing as well is you have to think that Louis XIV's furniture are extremely rare. Maybe a handful of furniture have survived from the 17th century. So yes, they are very, very important to many scholars, but also lovers of art.
When we are talking about them at Alnwick Castle, we call them the Cucci Cabinets. Can you explain why that's their title?
Everybody calls them the Cucci Cabinet. It would be difficult to find a better word, really, because Domenico Cucci was a maker, or I would argue probably the designer of those cabinets. It's a very complex point, actually. When I say designer, it's a teamwork in the workshop in the 17th century. But Domenico Cucci was the head of the workshop at the Gobelin factory. The Gobelin factory is a workshop that is under the patronage, under the responsibility of the crown, under the king, and that is in Paris. Gobelin is very famous normally for tapestry, weaving tapestry, but they also had cabinet making, bronze, and a Pietro Dre workshop. And Domenico Cucci, an Italian by birth, was brought to France to make some of those extraordinary furniture for the king. So that's why we call them the Cucci cabinet, because they are made by Cucci. And that is a short answer to your question. But what I would say as well, it's a very interesting subject, the 17th century, but even the 18th century, because there is a lot of immigration of artists and craftsmen from all over the world migrating to more or less where the client is. And Louis XIV was a great client. The French economy in the 17th century was doing quite well. So there was quite a lot of opportunities for many of those craftsmen, but also there was a politics of welcoming them. So Louis XIV and the court before him, Louis XIII, had a tendency to spend quite a lot of money outside France. But then eventually they realized that the best way to just kind of save money. So Colbert, the finance minister at the time of Louis XIV, decided to bring artists and craftsmen to make those pieces of furniture, to make those art, in order to not spend abroad, but to simply spend in-house. And then, of course, once you become a very good workshop, like Cucci was, as many cabinet maker at the time, then you start selling abroad. So that was a direct wish of the 17th century, was to bring the best artists, the best craftsmen to France, so you can make your furniture in-house and sell it to the rest of the world.
But these cabinets weren't made for the rest of the world. They were made for Versailles. They were made for the king's palace. Do we know much about where they were inside the palace?
Yes, and that's why they are very important, because they're very well documented. For the 17th century, they are unusually well documented, in fact. So they were made indeed for Versailles. Versailles was that palace that everybody knows, of course, this enormous palace just south-west of Paris. But at the time, Versailles was not the Versailles we know today. It was being built, it was being developed, and it was going to become the Versailles we know better. So they were made for Versailles. They were part of that kind of furnishing of Versailles. But you have to appreciate that Versailles, and like any royal palace, keeps changing every 5 minutes. The king was extremely dynamic. He had a really dynamic team of architect, designer. So they were made, indeed, specifically for one room at the end of the Great Hall of Mirror. Everybody's been to Versailles would have been through that long Hall of Mirror. And at the end of that room, at the end of that long room, there is another room called Le Salon de Mars, Mars. And that's where the cabinets were made for. They were delivered in about 1682, 1683. We're not exactly sure because the inventory is not as precise, but there is a bill for their description in the Salon de Mars, in the Mars room, in 1683. So they were made for that location. But the truth is that when they were made, they were already out of fashion. So you would have expected, most people buy furniture and keep them for a few years. Well, with Louis XIV, that's not always the truth. So they were delivered in 83, and already by 85 or 87, they were moved to store, or they were moved back to the Louvre in the center of Paris. So you can see that a cabinet like that only survived, more or less survived, stayed in Versailles for their first location only 5 years, which is very, very little. But the reality is the big fashion for those cabinets is the 1670s. And by the time they were delivered in 1683, they were clearly out of fashion. They took so long to make that it's one of the aspects why they were already out of fashion, because it takes so long to make a piece of furniture of that scale, but also of that complexity, that you just get it too late. The fashion has gone by then. And I'm going to say, actually, we know they took long because Domenico Cucci, unfortunately, lost his wife in 1676, which is 7 years before, 6 to 7 years before the delivery of the cabinet. And they made an inventory of all of the goods and all of the items in the workshop. And in the workshop, in 1676, you find the two cabinets being manufactured, unfinished.
Wow.
So the bronze were there, the Pietrajoy panel were almost finished, but they were not entirely finished, and you have to wait another 5 years to deliver them.
Generally, what are they made from, and how were they made?
For us today, the manufacture of a cabinet like that is, I would say, easy because I train as a cabinet maker, and I don't find them too complex. Maybe some people will find them quite complex. It is very time consuming rather than complex, I would say. Having said that, from an outside viewpoint, if you're not a craftsman, and particularly for the 17th century, everything in those cabinets is a technical challenge for the time. And that's what makes them also so precious and so rare in a way. Because, so what are they made of? You've got two cabinets. So even if we concentrate to one only, you've got two cabinets that are made of softwood, pine. So that's not a very extravagant material. But then that softwood material, that softwood carcass, is then veneered or decorated with a thin layer of the most expensive ebony from Madagascar or India. So we, at the 17th century, we're starting to have a lot of export or import, if you want to see it that way, of rare material coming from Madagascar, from India, or even from South America. But on the way to the Spice Island, where everybody was going to get their spices, the boat would stop and would collect a log of ebony, would collect very rare timber, and bring it back to Europe. So the cabinets themselves are just made of local softwood, local pine, and then veneered with black ebony. So already that's quite a challenge for the 17th century, because it's been only like 20 or 30 years that they're really experimenting with veneer. Before that, they do some veneering. The Italians are very good at doing veneering well before that. But in France, we are still very much in the solid wood. Even the King Louis XIV has quite a lot of solid wood walnut furniture at Versailles. It's not all that kind of very extravagant object. So veneering is something quite challenging for the time. But then what's really, really making those two cabinets impressive and very different are obviously the gilt bronze and then the Pietra Dore marquetry panel. So first I'm going to concentrate on the gilt bronze. So bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin, is something that you use normally to make sculpture. So in your garden, in the antiquities, Roman, and even, of course, in the Renaissance or in the court of Louis XIV, you've got that sculptural object, which are made of bronze. But that is, generally speaking, not gilded. It's only left patinated. By the 17th century, they're starting to move away from bronze and they start using brass, which is more or less the same. It's copper plus zinc. So you get that brass that is cast and then gilded with a very, very thin layer of gold. So all of the bright yellow decoration on those cabinets, so the two caryatid in the center, they're very nice. And of course, a big double L at the top. All of that is made of brass, which in English we tend to call bronze, but truly speaking, it's brass, that has been gilded with very, very fine layer of gold. An interesting point as well, the quality of the gold on those cabinets is extraordinary. There is no saving. It's only gold plating at the end of the day. So, you could say it's not solid gold. But having said that, it's a very, very thick layer of gold. And the way they used to achieve that is by doing what we call fire gilding. Fire gilding, it's a technique, it's a very ancestral technique where you mix gold with liquid mercury. So the two together are mixed together, and you end up with a kind of very thick, gloopy, almost like honey paint. And that is a paint made of gold and mercury, which, as you can already imagine, is extremely toxic, because playing with mercury is not something you'd like to do too long. So they mix mercury and gold. Obviously, mercury is a liquid metal and gold is a solid metal, but when the two are together, that gets you that kind of paste. And you apply that paint, that amalgam, to be correct in the term, so it's called an amalgam of gold and mercury. You apply it with a very stiff brush on top of your brass, which is normally very yellowish, greenish, not a very nice metal. And then once you've applied that amalgam, it sticks to the brass immediately, and you leave it in the fire. And with the heat of the fire, the mercury will evaporate in the air, and the gold will stick to the brass. So that's how in the 17th century, and for a very long time, mercury or brass were gilded. And again, I'm going to put an emphasis on that mercury, because as you can imagine, when you put it in the fire, it turns into fumes. And where does the fume goes? Directly into your lung. The survival rate of those craftsmen was very, very low. The average age, I dare thinking. So you've got a cabinet made of pine and ebony. Then it's decorated with those gilt bronze, which are extremely fine for the time. And Cucci actually is remembered for his Pietra Dore marquetry, for his hardstone marquetry, which I'm going to talk about soon. But he was after all, a very, very good bronze maker. At the Gobelin factory, he would have had a foundry, he would have been able to cast his bronze. But then once you cast something, you have a lot of work of refining the casting, because the casting is always going to be a bit rough. So Cucci was very good, or he had a very good team of what we call chaser, and they are the people refining the work. And that's why the Cucci cabinets are so grand and so beautiful, is if you look at the bronze in detail, they are some of the best produced for the 17th century. Very, very few people, unless you were a silversmith and working with silver, very few people were able to match that quality. You then have, at the same time of Cucci, you've got some very well-known artists like André Charleboul, another big name in French cabinet making. But the quality of Cucci bronze is above everybody else. And just one little point, actually, when you walk in this hall of mirror in Versailles, of course, everybody wants to go to this room where the Cucci cabinets are. But if you look today, the only thing that is left at Versailles that belongs to Cucci, all of this little mirror plate in that long gallery are framed with little bronze molding and with little fleur-de-lis, the symbol of the French crown. So the little fleur-de-lis in the corner. And all of them in bronze, gilded with mercury gilding, were made by Cucci as well. So Cucci is not only a cabinet maker, he's also a great bronze maker. But then what obviously sets this cabinet apart are those marquetry, which are called pietre dure, from the Italian, obviously, hard stone marquetry, if you translate it into English, panels that are decorating the cabinet. So I can't remember how many of those panels are on each of the cabinet, but they are some of the finest pietre dure panel you will find probably in the world. So my favorite one, if you look at some of those panels, so you've got two cabinets. You've got one which we normally call the Spaniel cabinet and one which we call the monkey cabinet. The Spaniel cabinet, it's because one is decorated with a little spaniel walking across in the central marquetry panel, and the other one is with a monkey. I actually adore the monkey, because the monkey, if you look at him very carefully, is kind of sitting down on the ground. He's got a bunch of fruit in his hand, and there is a tiny little stream, a tiny little water running in front of him, and you can see he's washing the fruit into the water and then eats them with his hand. The monkey is like, he must be about 5 centimeters tall maximum, 2 inches tall max. But if you look at his hand, if you look carefully at his hand, he's got fingernails that are made of a different color of stone. So that's where I'm coming to the technique. So the technique of pietre dure is like marquetry, and most people would have heard about marquetry made of wood, but this time it's not made of wood, but it's made of stone. So some of the most precious stone, lapis lazuli from the Middle East, jasper from Italy, precious marble, or even green verdoreza, which come from the top of a hill in Corsica, very, very difficult to get to. All of those precious stones were taken to Paris. And then, of course, a stone is whatever you get it. It could be a pebble, it could be a block, it could be anything. And then they are sliced in very, very thin slice of about 1 to 2 millimeters thickness. So you're making veneer, not of wood, but of stone. You can imagine it's extremely time consuming. Cutting a piece of wood, it's easy. Cutting a piece of stone, it's very slow. They didn't have diamond. So at the time, they were just using a wire. And on that wire, they just move that wire across the stone. And at the same time, they pour some water mixed with sand. And by slow abrasion, that wire eventually slices the stone into veneer. So you're left with all of this veneer, very colorful veneer. And like a marquetry of made of wood, every different color, every different part of that marquetry, every part of that design is a different piece of marble, cut to fit exactly the shape that you want, fitted next to each other like a jigsaw. So it's very similar to the jigsaw you do at Christmas. You just assemble all of the pieces next to each other. But of course, you know the frustration of finishing your jigsaw. You've got a 1,000-piece jigsaw at home. And then what do you do with it? You just break it, put it back in the box. Well, you're not going to do that with hard stone marquetry. You're going to have to glue your jigsaw onto something to stop it falling apart. So all of those precious veneer of stone are then glued on a very cheap slate, on an ordinary slate that you would find on your roof. It is glued with wax because obviously you're dealing with stone, you're not dealing with wood, so you're using a wax, which is a really good glue for stone. So back to the panel on the Cucci cabinet, that's how they're made. All of those decoration you see here and there are precious stone that are assembled together like a jigsaw. So the nails on that monkeys are effectively a tiny, tiny little piece of stone inlaid or cut to just fit exactly that place. And then the water, if you look at the water running in front of that monkey, it's a translucent agate stone. So it's totally translucent. So if you glue a translucent, transparent stone onto the slate, you're going to see the black slate underneath. So instead of doing that, they've applied a silver leaf between the slate and the translucent agate. So that silver leaf gives you that impression that you've got running water, and the agate gives you that kind of movement in the water. And of course, where the artists were very good at, so they had some really good drawing to start with. Someone would give them a drawing of a pigeon or of a duck, because we've got monkey, we've got pigeon, we've got pheasant, we've got spaniel, we've got quite a big menagerie, a lot of different animals on those cabinets. So someone would give them a drawing, and it's very likely that the drawing came from the main artist from the court of Louis XIV called Lebrun. Lebrun was a famous painter in the 17th century, and he would give a drawing to Cucci, and then Cucci would turn that into stone. The difficulty for any artist working with stone is to find exactly the piece of agate or the piece of stone that gives you that movement. So, for example, one of my other favorite, I've got quite a lot of favorite animal in those cabinets. I love the pigeon. The pigeon, if you look at the pigeon, he's standing up on his 2 feet, and he's got that enormous, underneath your head. And the stone really gives the movement of these feathers, and he's got that attitude. I absolutely adore the pigeon. He's got a really strong attitude looking at you. So you've got the pigeon. And the other one, which is quite cute, in my opinion, is the duck. I think the duck is quite nice. He's kind of a bit shy. He walks, he just straddles away, and he just suddenly turns his head to the people walking into the room. So, and actually, they're very good. Those marquetry are absolutely incredible. The quality of the design from Lebrun is fantastic, and the quality of the execution from Domenico Cucci, the choice of the stone, is absolutely incredible. And that's when I started, I said, I'm a cabinet maker, I can make things. Yeah, I mean, I could maybe make the box with the veneer, with the black veneer of those cabinets, but when it comes to the bronze, I can't. But when it comes to the pietra marquetry, let's be honest, there are maybe a handful of people in the world today that would be able to make that marquetry. But to make that quality, to be able to see in your eyes, to choose the right piece of stone and know it's going to work, I don't think anyone today would be able to do that. So that's why. So they are very complex. I try to minimize them because I don't want to scare people to think that they are very. Actually, to make those today would be a nightmare. So that's why they're so good. So I hope I answered briefly. I mean, without being in a workshop, it's very difficult to demonstrate to people how things are made. But you've got fire gilding, you've got pietra marquetry, and you've got woodworking with veneer on pine. So that's what you've got.
Yeah.
We're still in France at the moment.
We're still in France, and we're still in Versailles. We're going to the Louvre, we're going to the storeroom, and then we're going to London. Actually, not too far yet.
No.
And they've done London a couple of times since.
Yeah. So why a monkey and a spaniel? Were these just drawings that were supplied, or was there a reason for them?
It's kind of interesting question, because majority of furniture made in the court of Louis XIV or even in royal court tend to have a significance or a kind of message behind them. So all of those masks with Hercules or Cupid or things like that, all have a significance and try to tell you a story. With a Cucci cabinet, there is nothing really obvious. So the spaniel, for example, the spaniel is often related to the court of Spain. So the spaniel is a symbol of the court of Spain. So it could be that. But usually you tend to find the spaniel being either crushed by the French cockcrow because we just won a war against them, or if it's an alliance, it's going to be next to the French cockcrow. So, you could argue that normally the spaniel would be in a different kind of setting. And on those cabinets, the spaniel looks kind of an happy little dog just running around. So it doesn't feel like it is a Spanish spaniel. I mean, it is a Spanish spaniel in terms of the species, but not symbolizing Spain. We've got a cockcrow, actually, in the marquetry. There is a big Pratt cockcrow that could represent France, but I'm not even sure it's there. So really, I think they basically... there was a big thing in the court of Louis XIV and virtually every court of bringing the outside inside. So, the flower decoration, every flowers usually symbolize something, but you bring nature inside your palace. And the other thing as well is an idea that artist and craft can capture, can bring that nature and just cast it in stone. So a flower, for example, will die out, but not once it's turned into marquetry. So they're grand and beautiful, but compared to most furniture of the time, they don't really have a direct symbolic. What they tell you, however, and that's very important, those furniture are all about impressing the visitors or impressing an ambassador from abroad coming to visit Versailles. So what they do very well, those cabinets, is to impress you, to tell you that I've got a lot of money, I'm a very powerful king, and I can make anything out of bronze, stone, and no one else in the world, no one else in Europe can do as much as I can. So that's what the message is. Not the individual animal, for once, or not the individual bronze, but simply the overall look of the object. I am rich and powerful and very clever. I've got really good artistic sense. Every quality you can imagine of King Louis XIV are there in those cabinets. So that's what I think it is.
And do we know what they were used for?
Nothing.
Nothing.
They're just a show-off piece. Yeah. They're totally useless. If you ever open them, for example, when you open the door on the side, behind those doors you've got drawers, but the top drawers is so tall, is so high that even a man of the 21st century that tend to be slightly taller than Louis XIV, even a man of today would not reach or would not see what's inside. So that's a completely useless set of drawers. Then you've got that massive space between the two bronze caryatid in the center. There is barely any opening into that. There is nothing there. So they are not storage objects. And you wouldn't really open them. It's not the point. It's not the point of opening them and seeing the inside. They are mainly an object to impress the visitors. And most visitors would just walk through the gallery and not be allowed to touch them. So they're here to be impressive. But of course, some furniture and some part of Versailles were furnished with furniture to be used. So there is always the option that those cabinets, and we call them sometimes, so they're reminiscent of what we call the collector's cabinet. And the collector's cabinet is having drawers where you can store inside precious items. So there is always that option that maybe Louis XIV would store in them some very expensive and rare curiosity from the world or object of silversmithing, cut glass, all of those kind of very precious objects that they collected at the time. And they would be kept in the drawers. And when you've got a super important ambassador from a foreign country visiting you, not the normal Versailles visitor, but when you've got a super important one, they will then open the cabinet, open the drawer, and then come out with that beautiful piece of silversmith work and then talk about it for hours. So they are indeed conversation piece. So no, not to store your socks or to store your suit. Nothing like that.
That's one of the things that visitors to Alnwick quite often ask is what were they used for? But it's quite nice that today they're in a room, they're there to impress visitors.
Yeah.
Our visitors are not allowed to touch them, so they are serving their original purpose.
They do, and at Alnwick they look grand. They are just in a right proportion in that big room, in that big drawing room. So no, they still serve their purpose today, and I think most people would still be impressed by looking at them. You love them or you hate them, whatever. It's let's be honest, it's not for everyone to have that kind of cabinet. I wouldn't have that at home, even if I had the space for them. But they are incredibly impressive. They do work very well.
So we've been to Versailles. We know where they end up, but what happens in between? Where do they go once they leave the palace?
Well, they leave the palace very soon after they're made, as I said, because they are slightly out of fashion after less than 5 years. And by that time, Versailles is the center of the French court. For many political reasons, Louis XIV feels safer at Versailles than he feels safe in Paris. When he was young, he was part of a revolution and he moved to Versailles to be safe. So Versailles is the center. But then you've still got that enormous castle, royal castle in the center, which is called today the Louvre Palace. And that's often when furniture have finished with Versailles, they go back to the Louvre. So the cabinet went from Versailles to the Louvre. They were displayed, but not really the center of interest. They were getting out of fashion. And then eventually they may even have ended up in some form of attic, because when they get really out of fashion under the next King Louis XV, then they get stored into attic, into the top room, into the Louvre or everywhere. And we know that because there is one piece of archive where the man in charge of all of the furnishing from the Louvre and Versailles is asking money to the court, to the crown, to reinforce the floor of the attic, because the floor was just bowing under the weight of all of those heavy cabinets that were stored there and not loved. So they are unloved. Nobody liked them. And eventually, Louis XV, who is a great grandson of Louis XIV, so it's not straight after, unfortunately, the son of Louis XIV died and his grandson died. So then it's Louis XV's turn to become king. So King Louis XV, by the end of the 1740s, has what we could call a boots fair, a kind of clear out to raise money by selling some of those furniture. So you've got a number of perfectly legal auctions where those two cabinets appears at auctions in the 1751 auction, if I'm correct. So it's interesting because a lot of people go to England, and a lot of French people go to England to see all of those French furniture that have been sold during the French Revolution. But the French Revolution is 1789. And that's when, after the revolution, furniture are sold and then eventually find their way to England. But here in 1750, 39 years before the French Revolution, Louis XV already sells those cabinets. So there is no way a French guy could come and just say, well, our French furniture, they should be in France. No. The French crown sold them. So it's a perfect legal transaction on that one. So the French one sells it. And it's interesting because they were really not fashionable anymore, and they were not selling very well. They are not selling well as well, to the point that even there is a famous naturalist, Buffon, who was director of the Natural History Museum in Paris, who then walked through that cell, looking at some of those cabinets, and said to the king, well, you know what? I'm currently opening a gallery for stone and semi-precious stone and a mineral gallery. Could you please send me a couple of cabinets and a couple of tables made of those very expensive marquetry so I can just reuse the stone? So some of the furniture were sold, or not even sold, given to Buffon, given to that museum, and then they break them apart just to reuse a little piece of stone. And that's what happened to many of those cabinets. They were sold, they were either broken down for that museum, but most of them, what happened to them, the bronze were reused and probably recast, because you can recycle bronze quite easily. But the marquetry plaque, the marquetry of Artstone, were then dismantled, taken away from those cabinets, and reused on more fashionable objects. So the fashion wasn't anymore for those big cabinets. The fashion was for a lower piece of furniture, probably what we would call today a chest of drawers or a lower cabinet. So they would reuse part of those cabinets to make new piece of furniture. So that's happened to virtually 99% of those cabinets. But of course, and we are very, very lucky today, that did not happen to those two cabinets. They were left as they were. They were bought in 1751 by someone we don't know. They were probably restored in 1753 because something really fun when we conserve those cabinets, we open the box, remove the bronze, and then inside there was a signature of two cabinet makers in 1753 with the date 1753, one for Valin and one for Réaubur. Réaubur, I think it's François Réaubur, was a carpenter in the 1750s. So we know that they were acquired in 51 by someone. They were restored. They were looked after properly, obviously, because they are probably used by someone. But we don't know what happened to them. And then they reappear, we don't know how, in 1822, when the third Duke of Northumberland then decided to buy them. And at the time, of course, the fashion has changed again. And the English aristocracy in particular was really in love with those kind of cabinets and those kind of historical furniture. So the Louis XIV's cabinet, or the Cucci cabinet, but by that time now we are almost forgetting about Cucci. I don't even know if at the time they knew it was by Cucci because or attributed to Cucci, because now really what we are buying in 1822 is that idea that we have a Louis XIV's cabinet with a double L for Louis and the fleur-de-lis all over the cabinet. So we basically have a French royal piece of furniture at home. And that's what the Third Duke does. He acquires two very important historical Louis XIV's piece of furniture. And the extraordinary thing about them, he acquires two cabinets that are intact. They are more or less the way they were when they were first made in 1685. And that is extremely rare. All of the double L for the kings are still there. All of the fleur-de-lis are still there. And that's a miracle, because during the French Revolution, all of those furniture with double L, they would be removing the double L, they would be removing the fleur-de-lis. Any royal symbol in France was washed away, but not on those cabinets. So 1822, they find their way to the Third Duke. He acquires them. Then he has them restored, because they need a bit of restoration. And we know the firm that restored them, a very famous English firm called Morel and Hugh. And what Morel and Hugh do is very minimal. They redo the gilding on the base. So the gilding on the base, and we know a little more from the conservation, there are 3 layers of gilding. One of these layers is in fact from 1822. The one you see today is 1822, the gilding on the wooden base. And then the Duke, because thinking they were probably not tall enough, which I don't know, then add that black plinth at the bottom. So if you look at the cabinet today, they've got this black base, which is about like 10-inch tall. It's mahogany and black like ebony, but it's not ebony. And that was added in the 1820s. But apart from that base, apart from the gilding that is renewed on the wood carving on the base, and of course a tiny little detail, but that could have happened as early as 1750, the legs, the ox legs, that are today dark green, a bit like bronze, they were originally gilded at the time of Louis XIV, but now they are this dark green color. But by really, incredible miracle, they are real Louis XIV's object. Nothing seemed to have been changed. And of course, a couple of restoration here and there, but they are in very, very good shape. So we are 1822. 1823, the restoration is finished by Morel and Hugh, or Hugh and Morel, whatever you prefer. It's a partnership. And then they go to Northumberland House, the big London house for the Duke in London. Unfortunately, the house doesn't exist anymore. It was located, if you look at the Trafalgar Square today and you go right down towards the Thames, there is a big road going straight down. And unfortunately, that's where the house was, in the middle of that road. So when they created that road, Northumberland House was destroyed. So the Duke sold the house, I can't remember when exactly, but by the end of the 19th century, and then moved to another place in London. The cabinet by that time were a bit of limbo because we don't have Northumberland House anymore. So they go on loan to the V&A in 1919, if I'm correct. 1919, they find their way to the V&A for a loan. So they go on exhibition in London. And then eventually, by that time, Alnwick Castle, I think, is extensively restored and refurbished, and it's becoming the main seat for the Duke. So by that time, Alnwick Castle is now a nice, dry castle, and that's when the cabinet find their way from London, V&A, for the first time to the north of England, very near Scotland, as we know. So, yes, they move north. And since 1920, they've been at Alnwick almost uninterrupted. They came down to me for restoration, that we know. And when I say came down, they came down to me in Kent. So they had a little trip in Kent. They also had a little trip at the V&A in 2008 or 9, I can't remember. And that was a trip because there was an exhibition about Louis XIV and Baroque. And then they also, for the first time since 1750, or at least 1822, they also went back, or only one of them went back to Versailles for another exhibition. So in 2008 or 9, they went for 3 months at Versailles for the famous Louis XIV exhibition there. And that was the first time since 1750. And happily, and I'm very glad of that, I'm French, but I'm happy they are in Alnwick. And happily they went back to Alnwick after that exhibition. And some people would argue they should be at Versailles. Yes and no. They are Louis XIV's cabinet, but they now got their history, they're part of history from the Duke of Northumberland. They belong to Northumberland as much as Louis XIV's. At least the Dukes looked after them very well for the last 200 years, as instead to Louis XIV, who only had them for 5 years. And the truth, to be fair, on that, I may be losing my French passport here. The truth is that I think they are better in England because Versailles of today is not the Versailles of Louis XIV. So where would you have them today? If you were to return them in Versailles, the Salon de Mars, where they used to be displayed, is not here anymore. I mean, it is here anymore, but it's been extensively modified. So they would go into a museum gallery. They would go somewhere. They would maybe go in Versailles. But no, they're very, very good at Alnwick. They serve their purpose. They are very grand and very well looked after. So here they are. Since 1823, they are in the collection of the Duke of Northumberland.
And in terms of when you worked on them, what was it like to work on those cabinets, and what was it like for you to work on them?
Stressful, rising, didn't sleep too well. What else could I list? No, it's kind of interesting because obviously that's not the only important object I've worked on, hopefully, I think. But they are unique. And to know that I was the first person since 1822 to restore them was kind of bizarre, a privilege, but also a very kind of big responsibility. It was an 18-month project, and that was 18 months of not sleeping too well because it's a very big responsibilities to not only do the conservation work, but also to have them in your studio for that long. Luckily, I never had both of them at the same time. I only had one at a time. I mean, to be honest, the workshop wouldn't take two. But no, it's kind of, I specialize on objects of that period, and it's always an honor to work on furniture that belongs to Louis XIV. But those one, to me, they were the most. It was possibly the most incredible experience in my career. The last time they were restored was 1822, as we said before, and it was the first time that they ever been dismantled and restored since. So just a simple fact of receiving them and opening the box and finding that signature of 1753 restorer, and you just know that you're becoming part of that history, that you're becoming part of it. But at the same time, you don't want to do the wrong thing, and that's when it becomes very stressful. Because as a conservator, you've got some idea of what you're trying to achieve, but you also have to respect the client's wish. So the owner is the Duke of Northumberland, and he's got his own view on the way they should look, the way we should do it. And fortunately for that project, we created what we call a small advisory panel, a conservatory panel. Instead of me being on my own, doing all of the decision and getting it wrong, we made sure that we had a group of people to discuss every aspect and every part of the project. So we had the sister of the Duke, representing obviously Yannick Castle. We had the curators from the V&A who just joined us. We had the curators from the National Trust. We had two conservators from the V&A as well, who were looking at the technical side with me in terms of when I was saying I'm going to do that, they were more technical, so they could answer that. So we had a range of people with expertise, and of course Claire, the curators from Yannick, she was in charge of the project. So we had all of that group of people advising on what to do and to do it right, or hopefully right. But also I was very adamant when we started talking about having that group of people. I said, but at the end of the day, yes, it's in England and it's in an English collection, but it's a French piece. You cannot conserve a French piece, even in England, in the same way that you would conserve an English piece. The approach to the material and to the look is very different. So I insisted of having a curators, and Bertrand Rondeau from Versailles joined us in the conservation panel. So we had a really good group, we had a really good team of people from Versailles and people from Yannick and people from the V&A to discuss the process. So yeah, that made the process a bit easier. But at the end of the day, it was 18 months of work here in the workshop. And I remember, I never look at the value of items, and I don't even want to talk about that. We know those cabinets are rare, so therefore they're going to be expensive. We know that they are expensive. But that's not the point. When I conserve an object, I do it the same way for a cheap object or an expensive object. When we say they are valuable, there are two ways of looking at value. Financial value is one thing, and I don't understand that. It's not my job to understand financial value. But historically, they are extremely important. And that's where the value lies. They've got the history that make them extremely rare and valuable, not in money, but in history. If anyone believe in that and think that an object have a soul, I mean, those cabinets, they've seen so much since 1680. They're just unique. And that was hard for me. Because working on an object like that, you then become part of the story. And you really don't want to get it wrong. Because, I don't want to be the one that in 20 years' time someone says, well, why did Yannick do that? He should never have done that. And yeah, I'm not saying we've done it perfectly. We've done what we could do with the technique and the technology we had 10 years ago. And I'm still very pleased with what we've done to it. It is conservation, it's not restoration. But yeah, that was quite something to work on it. And I remember one thing is when I then delivered the cabinet back after 18 months of work, the curator at Yannick said to me, but have you signed your work? Because obviously I did a conservation report as we do today. But she said, have you signed the cabinet? And I looked at her, I said, Of course not. You don't do that nowadays. Réaumur did it in 1753. Moreland, you may have done it. I mean, if they want to sign in the cabinet, they do what they want. There is even inside the cabinet, there is a lovely little drawing, a profile drawing, which date probably from the 1680s. It might even be a portrait of Cucci, I don't know. But there is a small drawing inside. I first refused it, and then eventually she convinced me to take a pencil and very carefully next to Réaumur, I did put Yannick Chastang, 2011. So yes, it was an incredible experience. It's not because it's you recording it, but it's actually one of my favorite objects I've restored over my career. My career is not done yet, but of all of the objects, it was such an honor and fantastic object. You do that once in your lifetime, and hopefully it's going to last for another 200 years before it needs to be restored again. The less we do, the best it is. Mm-hmm. So that was a fun project.
Why should people come to Alnwick Castle now to see these cabinets?
I've been going to Alnwick myself quite a few times, regardless of the cabinet, because it's a lovely collection to visit anyway. But anyone who's in love with decorative art, anyone who's interested in decorative art, they're so important in the history of decorative art, not only French decorative art, but in general, because their influence is all over Britain. So you go to Alnwick, you obviously enjoy the great collection, you enjoy the great display. Of course, some people enjoy flying on a broom. That's I haven't tried myself. I'm not good at flying. But no. Go to Alnwick to see this cabinet, because they are probably the most important cabinet in the world in terms of history of decorative art of the 17th century. So
Lovely. Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the Alnwick Castle podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, and yes, look after the cabinet.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from Yannick all about these amazing items. If you'd like to see the Cucci cabinets in person, you can find them in the drawing room at Alnwick Castle. You can join a guided tour of the staterooms, or ask the guide in the room and they will tell you all about them throughout our visitor season.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more about the art and collections of Alnwick Castle, please head into our back catalogue to find episode 7, The Art of Alnwick Castle, featuring art critic Waldemar Januszczak, or episode 29, all about caring for the collections.
We'll be back with another Alnwick Castle podcast in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Deborah.
And I've been Daniel.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.